Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 2. Today we are going to be talking a little bit more about the Cold War. As we go through today's lecture, the Cold War will improve, and then it'll come dangerously close to turning into a hot war once again. Anyway, as we're going through, please pay attention to the terms in the upper left-hand corner of this slide, and let's get to it. For the sake of review, let's just go back over what the Cold War was. It was an economic and political contest rather than a military confrontation that lasted from 1946 through 1991. On one side was the Soviet Union and its allies. Economically, this side was dominated by communism, while the governing structure was dictatorship. The other side was led by the United States and its allies. This side's economic structure was capitalistic, while politically the governments were typically democratic. The divide between the two sides was most apparent in Europe. The heavily armed border between East and West was known as the Iron Curtain, which was first enunciated by Winston Churchill in 1946. The Iron Curtain divided Germany in half, with East Germany being a communist dictatorship and West Germany a capitalist democracy. The city of Berlin was also divided. The former capital of Germany was well within the communist nation of East Germany. However, the western half of the city was an oasis of democracy, surrounded by a sea of communist dictatorship. The two sides to Berlin were literally divided by the Berlin Wall, a concrete and barbed wire structure that cut the city in half. The wall was constructed in 1961 to prevent citizens of East Berlin from freeing their oppressive society for the freedom of the West. This wall quickly became the most hated symbol of the Cold War. But Europe wasn't the only Cold War hotspot. In 1950, forces from communist-controlled North Korea launched a massive invasion of the non-communist South. The war lasted more than 3 years, and ultimately it ended with Korea divided into a communist North and a non-communist South. The division continues to this day. Another Cold War hotspot was Vietnam, a small nation in Southeast Asia. When communism threatened to devour Vietnam in the 1950s and the 1960s, the U.S. tried to invoke the containment policy again, with less successful results. The war divided Americans, many of whom were angry that soldiers were dying so far from home. Ultimately, the U.S. pulled out of the war in 1973, and Vietnam fell to communism 2 years later in 1975. Another hotspot was the nation of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December of 1979 to prop up a communist government that was faced with revolution. The U.S. and its allies vehemently protested the aggressive move. The U.S. announced an embargo of grain sales to the Soviet Union and later boycotted the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. Meanwhile, closer to home, the U.S. was concerned by a growing communist insurgency in Central America. The poor of El Salvador and Nicaragua turned to communism as a possible solution to their problems. The U.S. responded by funding some questionable characters in both nations. These U.S. allies often murdered their own people in the name of fighting communism. These Cold War crises were playing out against a background of a nuclear arms race. By the end of the 1960s, both sides had far more nuclear weapons than they could possibly use in war. That was intentional. The strategy was called Mutual Assured Destruction, or MAD. The idea was that neither side would launch a nuclear attack as long as they knew the other side would respond in kind. In 1969, fearing nuclear confrontation, the U.S. and the Soviets sought to relax the tensions between the two sides by sitting down to discuss issues like nuclear testing and limits on nuclear weapons. This relaxation of tensions became known as Detente. It ended with the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan in 1979, when the Cold War began to heat up once again. But Afghanistan was not the only sign that the Cold War was heating up. In 1980, the American people elected Ronald Reagan to the presidency. Reagan made it clear that he favored tough talk with the Soviets. This became clear in his so-called Evil Empire speech in 1983, where he declared that the Cold War was more than a battle between two views of the world. It was a moral battle between good and evil. Here is an excerpt from that speech. Quote, "I urge you to beware the temptations of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire, to simply call the arms race a giant misunderstanding, and thereby remove yourself from the struggle between right and wrong and good and evil." Reagan's actions did have an impact on U.S. culture. The new focus in the Cold War led some to speculate on what a possible Soviet takeover might look like. In 1984, the film Red Dawn depicted a Soviet invasion of the United States. It was a very popular movie, and it scared a lot of people. Also scaring people was the film called The Day After. In 1983, ABC television broadcast The Day After, which talked about what might happen should a nuclear war occur. The film was watched by millions across the country, and it led many to call for limits on nuclear weapons. European culture was also affected by the increase in tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In 1983, the West German group Nena released the song 99 Red Balloons, which depicted an accidental nuclear war between East and West. Thus, in the 1980s, tensions between East and West were higher than at any other time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. This was symbolized by the buildup in nuclear weapons by both sides, as well as by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. What we didn't know, however, was that the Cold War was actually winding down. Within a few years, it would be over. But we'll discuss that in a future lecture.